Welcome to another episode of APIs You Won't Hate. Today we're talking about responsible deprecation, how to handle dropping both properties from your API endpoints as well as API endpoints themselves, and all of the mystery and magic surrounding how to responsibly remove APIs from production. As always, I'm Matt, and I'm joined here with Phil and Mike. Guys, how's it going?
Hey, not bad. What's up?
Yeah, I'm hanging in the depths of winter here, but we'll get through.
Yeah, like it dropped 2 to 4 inches of snow in Nashville over the week, which is incredibly unlike everything we've ever seen, and then we're getting another 2 to 4 inches tonight. So it's pretty interesting.
Oof.
Yeah, I don't really understand what's going on with the world when Texas, Austin, Texas, all my colleagues over there at Stoplight are completely snowed in and have no power, but like Poland's pretty fine. I don't really understand a world where that's happening.
I mean,
pretty bizarre.
There's a lot to unpack there, as I've been reading over these last couple days, but suffice it to say, climate change is real. So anyways, we are talking responsible deprecation, things like how to remove API endpoints from production. If you're a smaller shop, a smaller one-person shop, if you have an API and you're kind of doing it yourself, it's kind of easy to handle. It's not that hard to remember which APIs you've removed, but like if you're at a company like, let's say, Stripe or, Google, something like that, like, what is the responsible way to remove an API from production in a massive global context like those companies are without breaking things?
Yeah, totally. And I want to add kind of a little bit more context around this too for the people of the world who might have experiences similar to mine, where I'm largely consuming APIs as an end user developer. From the external perspective too, a lot of the time that may look like a feature going away or a feature changing significantly in a way that can sort of seem painful, right? Like you may, from the release perspective of developer, it may sound like something I've been using is going away. And usually, hopefully, if it's done well, there's like a timeline on that, and you may get 30 or 60 or 90 days notice or something like that before the change happens. And that's part of why I wanted to talk to you guys about this, is kind of to pick your brains about things you've seen, good, bad, and otherwise, with deprecation, with features going away, and maybe even to an extent new features being rolled out. What's the best way to do that and to communicate that with the people who need to hear about it?
Yeah, there's so many ways of doing it, all of which kind of solve a piece of the puzzle and work in different contexts. But probably something to add first is that people might be listening to this thinking, like, why would you take an endpoint away? Why would you take features away? You only ever add to an API. And those people might be big fans or proponents of kind of global versioning, where you have version 1 of the entire API and then version 2 of the entire API. And, that has a lot of pros and cons itself. And without really getting into why global versioning, it can be a massive time suck and just push all of the hard work onto your clients. Even if you are adding version 2, then at some point you have to deprecate version 1 and take that away. Because even if you want to support, 2 major versions, if you release version 3 or version 4, you don't want to support all of those APIs all at the same time forever. So you will at some point have to figure out how to turn off some of those older versions, even if you aren't using something like Evolution, where you might take away just one endpoint or take away some properties that aren't being used anymore. And yeah, I think some of the most common ways of doing it, like if you signed up for an API key, with most of these big APIs, right? Like you sign up for OAuth credentials, and when you sign up, you use your user account. If it's Facebook, you have to upload a passport, so they know who you are, and they can email you about stuff. So I've noticed I'm getting a lot of emails from GitHub right now that we are using a form of authentication that is going away at some point. I've been getting those emails for about a year. Which suggests that A, GitHub are doing a great job of kind of telegraphing their changes a long way off, and B, we're not doing a very good job of keeping up to date with them. But at some point that will get turned off, and if we've been ignoring them for a year, then that's entirely on us. But emails are a pretty common thing when it's authenticated API. Putting things in docs is pretty useful. You can just put, this is deprecated, and OpenAPI supports that. You just put deprecated true on the operation, and so anyone who's coming to it new knows not to look at that. But people aren't going back to your docs all the time. So if they've integrated with your API a year ago or 3 years ago, they're not going to sit there hitting refresh, to come back and have a look. So you've also got to try and work out how to get in touch with people in a way that they'll know about. And a way that I quite like that's quite new in HTTP world is the sunset header, and even newer than that, the deprecation header, and we can talk about them a little bit. But the general idea is that you just kind of put into the message like, hey, here's your response, but by the way, it's deprecated. You should do something about that. And then you can have tooling that automatically notices that thing's about to go away. And that's something I'm a big fan of, as well as emailing when possible and documenting when possible, letting them know in the actual message so it can't really be missed. It's pretty helpful.
Yeah, so does that sunset header or the deprecation header allow for any way to tell end users that the deprecation is coming, or are those typically used once it's already deprecated?
Yeah, the deprecation header, so sunset and deprecation are subtly different in what they mean. Deprecation means like this is or has been deprecated. You can either put deprecation true, and it just means this has been deprecated now. Or you can put a date, which will mean if it's in the future, like this will be deprecated on this date, or if it's in the past, then this was deprecated then. And sometimes dates are useful if you work at a company that is really kind of rigid and on top of their deployments and on top of hitting their deadlines. You want to give someone clear warning. But it can also just be slightly confusing because you say like, oh, we're going to deprecate this next week because we think we'll have it replaced, or next month or next year, whatever. And then like scope creep happens, or you miss your deadline, and then it says it's been deprecated on a specific date, but it hasn't been. And why did you bother doing that? So true is, simple. And then sunset is more, this is going away. Because deprecation doesn't mean removal. Deprecation means like, don't use this anymore because it might be removed at some point. And sunset is how you do that. So sunset doesn't require deprecation first. They can be used separately or together, right? But sunset means like after the date in this header, this probably won't work anymore. This should be considered a production issue if the date is, now or in the past. Like you should fucking panic and motivate yourselves to do something about this. Whereas a deprecation, especially if it's in the future or recent past, doesn't really matter all that much.
Yeah, sure. And, no doubt those two types of headers can be confusing, but they serve worthwhile purposes, and there's definitely good reason to use each. And particularly because they're both sort of relatively new, you might see one or both used inconsistently across APIs that you're consuming, or even in ways that might not be recommended. It's probably also worth talking about for a minute, like maybe some of the business decision type drivers that would cause an API to go away. Because it might not just be, hey, we've moved in a different direction, but oftentimes the companies that are offering these analytics, offering these APIs, have analytics around what's being used in their APIs and what's causing them trouble, what's causing support tickets, that sort of a thing. I know, for example, Stripe is really good about providing advance notice that things are going away, and usually they give a decent explanation of, hey, we're changing this API in a year and a half, even sometimes, and here's what you need to know. A lot of the time, in the case of Stripe, it might have to do with regulatory changes or important security updates that are coming, and they do a really good job of setting out comms along the way, saying like, we're a year and a half out, here's what you need to know, prepare for this, it's going to take a lot of work, and then you'll get a message every 3 months until a year out, and every month from there on, and then as it gets closer, you get more and more notification that changes are coming and that you need to pay attention. I think the best providers also know when you've made the needed changes, right? Like they know when you've started consuming the new API or when you've stopped using the broken, not broken, soon to be sunset and deprecated one, and that obviously is a sign of a pretty mature product. And isn't a luxury that we all will always have, especially for things that are, particularly minor use cases.
Yeah, Stripe are really on.
Oh, go ahead, Phil.
I'm always talking, Matt. You go ahead.
Well, I was just, like along with Stripe, like Plaid is another pretty big API provider in the fintech world, and obviously, regulatory rules and guidelines are constantly changing, especially around consumer credit cards, and bank accounts, which is what Plaid really does a great job of doing. But then also, I think it comes down to a lot of APIs, especially like in a startup world, were built by maybe one or two people. They smashed it all together really fast so they could get the product to market to validate their idea. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, this actually works. This actually is making us money. But we totally glued parts A, B, and D together, left out C. And so I think that's a huge determination of why they should deprecate the, let's call it V1 API and start moving towards the V2 APIs. After a while, you have better engineers around, you have better thought processes. You may have introduced like Open API or something like that, and now you want to kind of give your consumers a much better end product too.
Yeah, that is a really important point. I think something that's often ignored from the conversations around versioning and deprecations, the two things are obviously pretty intertwined, is that regardless of how you technically decide to alert consumers of your deprecations and your changes, you have to make sure that those changes are actually worthwhile, and not just like, we changed our naming conventions, we did this thing, we have switched from bearer token to JWT for some reason. Like, every time that you make the consumer do something that doesn't actually add any value to them, they're getting more annoyed with you, with the API provider, right? And so the reasons for doing stuff, as long as you make it clear, make sense. Like, if you're switching authentication strategy because there are security issues with the old one, brilliant. Communicate that, right? If you're switching from kind of one domain model to another because you found out that people were having to make 100 requests to solve a certain workflow, then it totally makes sense to add some more resources that handle that workflow better, or the other way around. If people are fetching these giant resources and it's really hard to compute all the data they need, and it's causing instability across your platform because these reports are being generated on the fly or whatever, then it totally makes sense to switch to a different thing, which will be much quicker and people will enjoy the speed. But you have to be able to communicate the actual benefits they'll get by investing time, effort, and money in switching their API. Because once an integration is done, people generally expect it to continue to work unless there's a really good reason why it has to break. And that reason shouldn't just be, well, we couldn't figure out API evolution, so we've just made a V2 API and you should go figure out what's changed because, I don't know, it's a major version, everything's different now, fuck you. Which is what a lot of people do. That's not very helpful.
Yeah, I think this is one of those opportunities too where some product teams can forget that they have the advantage of having people who are listening and people who are communicating with them that are prior users. I've seen some really interesting discussions about APIs changing on GitHub, right? Long before the change is actually in place, developers will put out an issue or a pull request or something that says, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. Here's the reasons why, and here's all the long history and all the related issues if you want to go spelunking. And that may show up in the release notes for an API change that says like, hey, in the future, this is going to change. Please read this if you use X, Y, and Z feature. And oftentimes that process doesn't end up being as straightforward as you think, right? Like they might announce that they're thinking about a change, and that change gets pushed back and back and back because of discussions happening on the issue. But it should be reminded that that's a thing that's actually really productive, right? By consulting the people who are using your API and really getting feedback from them on what changes are happening and why, you prevent yourself from making breaking changes that ruin your perception with the developer community that's using your thing, that cause heartache for your internal team, for your support team, and cause churn in customers and things like that. So often if you're in a position to be able to communicate as well as listen, you can set yourself up for a little less pain here and there. And it's probably worth mentioning too that sometimes that deadline that you put out for a release needs to change, and it's better that it changes than you sort of dig your heels into the ground and make some damaging choices.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is like if you're willing to like let's say you're consuming an API and you're willing to talk to them and be open about like their changes coming out, and they may give you beta access before the actual API release. and take your feedback into account as they're deprecating and removing certain features, as a way to kind of understand better what the users are using too. So like if you're just kind to people, if you're just nice to people, which is really hard on the internet, I know. I watch Phil all the time struggle with it. You might be able to get, like some, I don't want to call it privileged access, but companies may be more willing to work with you on breaking changes, as long as it's not like too much of a ask, if that makes sense.
Yeah, companies usually want feedback on how stuff works, right? Like, and instead of just kind of internally testing it, if they can get some early adopters, that's great. Things like feature flags work just as well on an API as they do anywhere else, right? You can easily flag off new experimental API endpoints, right? And you can kind of, especially if they're using something like OAuth or they have credentials, then you know who they are. You can easily flag them off and say like this token belongs to this user. You already have that logic, and this user belongs to this group of people who are allowed to access this feature. Whatever feature flag implementation you've got, give it to those people, get feedback on that, or just shove it up there and see who notices and get feedback from those people. But getting feedback on how things work before you kind of make it generally available is really powerful. Otherwise, you end up on version 3 and then version 4 and then version 5 and then version 6 because you keep getting more feedback. You're like, oh yeah, crap. Well, this is in production, so let's just make another version, and I'm sure the next one will be right. And then, oh crap, we got more feedback. Well, I'm sure the next one will be right.
Yeah, and that relationship is beneficial in both directions too. As the team building the API, you're getting valuable feedback that can save you a lot of time, and as the let's call them beta users of sort of feature flagged API functions, you're able to provide feedback that inevitably will help whatever it is you're building, and also putting yourself in a place of trust where you may eventually be able to ask for features or ask for things being catered to your needs, because providing a certain amount of valuable feedback sort of makes you an insider eventually anyway, and becoming that kind of trusted relationship on both sides is really, really useful.
Yeah.
So, all right, here's the hypothetical for you. What I'm curious is, concretely, let's say the three of us had a product, we were building an API for whatever it may be. Doesn't really matter. And we've come together, put our heads together, and decided that we have this feature that is we put out into the world years ago, and it no longer deserves to be there. We're wasting resources on it, and we don't think it's useful. What's the process you would take from there to start communicating that and put it together into a plan to deprecate it?
First thing I would do is update my documentation to stop any new users coming in. Maybe the first thing I do is make sure I have some sort of analytics on it, something like New Relic, something that helps me know how many people are using that endpoint, right? Some sort of chart I can make over time of how much usage, how many requests are going to this endpoint. So if you can't track a problem, you can't fix it, right? So step 1, track it. Step 2, I would probably throw something in the documentation that says, hey, this is going away. The new users won't start using it. So that line should either be flat or go down. Then if I had their emails, would email people out being like, hey, this is going away on this date. Here's a blog post that explains why. And then if I was using deprecation or sunset headers, I would, put that date in ahead of time. The reason you might not use deprecation at the moment is because that header is still in draft. It's going through the IETF, process and will eventually become a standard. But for now, sunset is standard and has a bit more tooling. So maybe you choose to still use sunset. But either way, whatever header you use, you can put in a link that can be to another endpoint. It could be a link to documentation. It could be a link to a blog post. So that blog post I've already written, I would put a link to that in the sunset header, so that people who see the deprecation messages can go and have a look and learn more. And then I would wait and see how the usage of that is going. And if usage isn't dropping, I would try and figure out who I could reach out to. If there are a couple of clients that are still using it, then I would go and approach them if possible. And yeah, if I was releasing SDKs, I would make sure that my SDKs were like warning people as well. And whether that's through generically my SDKs looking for the sunset header, or whether that's specifically my, a new version of my SDKs have been built that uses some sort of language level deprecation warning, like Java, you use the deprecated annotation, and then like you'll get Java errors saying, this method is gone. And just keep doing anything along those lines I could until enough people aren't using the thing that I can just turn it off. Because there will always be some people. There'll be somebody on an old version of the iOS app that refuses to update, and their app will break, and then they'll update, and then it'll be fine.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, those are all, I think that follows more or less what I would expect. I think some of the things you said, too, apply tactically throughout the process, like being able to measure that the email you sent out to let people know that things are going to be deprecated, that is actually landing and people are reading that is important. And you're probably going to want to track things like, here's the traffic to those blog posts that we linked to see how those are sort of going up and down, because those are probably also leading indicators that people are starting to do the work to wind down use of those APIs. And obviously the softer touch things are keeping an ear to the ground for Twitter, Reddit, GitHub, wherever you talk to your users, maybe Stack Overflow, and see if they have questions or concerns, or if anyone's lighting their hair on fire, panicking about what's going on. You can start to manage those processes as well.
Yeah, there are some approaches that I know people have tried to use, like, sometimes things break because somebody refuses to refresh their JavaScript single-page application. They got some React app that's just been trucking along on the same browser session for a year somehow, whatever. They've got caffeine running and they don't turn it off. And so when you have things like that, if people have said like, if you've got a sunset date coming in on a response that's in the past, maybe you should refresh the page, things like that, just to try and get the newest version before it vanishes. But yeah, there's a lot of things you can try. Would you like to hear how to not do it? If anyone, or does anyone have any?
No, let's do it.
Ideas?
Let's hear the horror stories.
So there's a lot of times that stuff gets turned off without warnings, deprecations, anything useful, an email, anything, no letter posted to your house. Often it's Facebook. They just turn shit off because they feel like it. Facebook did something really weird quite recently that just angered me conceptually, and just literally and physically, in every way. They have, Instagram used to have like an OEmbed API. OEmbed is like a special kind of, it's kind of like an API in a way. You hit a certain URL. Actually, yeah, it is an API. They have like an endpoint that's called OEmbed, and you pass in a URL, and it will return a JSON payload with all sorts of metadata about that thing, like some HTML embed code and some other kind of, stuff, so that when you are trying to embed resources from another website into your website, it has a representation. That's a very weird description. Basically, if you want to embed Instagram images in your cycling blog, then you can use OEmbed to do that. And so I had, there's like this amazing OEmbed plugin where you just put the URL to the Instagram picture in your Markdown, and then it goes, oh, that's an Instagram URL. I know what that is. Hits the OEmbed API, brings back that HTML, and embeds it in there, so that I don't have to go through and click like copy embed code, copy embed code, copy embed code every single time I want to show off my holiday snaps. So that was an open public API that worked fine and free, and you didn't need an account. You just used it and it was fine. And then Facebook want to own all your data all the time, and basically decided they were going to make a brand new Facebook OEmbed, not the Instagram OEmbed, but a brand new Facebook Graph API one. And that required an access token, which is really weird and kind of breaks the whole concept of open API, of OEmbed. But to do that, you need a Facebook account, and that has to be verified, and that means you have to upload your fucking passport. And then they rejected my passport for some reason, and I've deleted my Facebook account a long time ago. So I was like trying to get my like developer Facebook account approved, and then that didn't work. And it was just all this nonsense. And what really annoyed me about the deprecation process of that was there wasn't one. On their documentation, on their API documentation, it said, the endpoints documented on this page will be deprecated on October 24th, 2020, and return error code 400. Please use this other one instead. There's two things wrong with that. The first one is that I was using it on October 15th or whatever it was, well ahead of the day that it was meant to get deprecated. I was using it ahead of the deprecation date, and it was already not working, right? So that's rude. And there was no communication apart from this documentation page, which is also rude. But deprecation means warning people that it's about to go away. Deprecation doesn't mean suddenly jamming error code 400 into everything, because that's not how status code works. Good old Facebook, they don't understand how status codes work. They usually just do 200 OK for everything, and now they're doing 400 on something that actually worked. So all of these generic tools that we're expecting to hit an endpoint, get some JSON back, and then, embed the HTML into people's blog posts or whatever else, it started breaking... Oh, God. Phone call. Hang on. My dad's got a very old phone and it's ringing.
That's amazing.
Oh, that's amazing.
Nice.
Nice.
Yeah, so instead of getting the HTML back and getting a 200 OK and being like, fantastic, that worked fine, all the builds started breaking. Jesus Christ. Hang on. How many phones have we got in the family?
This is amazing. You can't pay for this level of entertainment.
This is just great quality podcasting, yeah. So instead of the thing actually working, you get your JSON back and it says 200 OK. You get the JSON back and it says 400, so every single generic HTTP tooling just assumes that it's completely broken, as it should. So that breaks the builds, and my blog wouldn't deploy. And I'm sure somewhere somebody had a much bigger problem than their cycling blog not deploying for a little while. But that sort of idiocy is kind of how to not go about deprecations. You don't just write something on your documentation and hope people see it. You don't pick a date and then just do it ahead of time, and you don't just break it without any actual other sort of warning. You know what I mean? That's just the worst rollout of a deprecation.
Yeah, super messy. I can understand there's probably some challenges with something like an embed API where you might not even know how to contact all of the people using it, but it's easy to argue that they took the probably worst path to deprecating that, especially the part where they killed it days before it was supposed to be, without any warning about that. That's a lot. That's compounding challenges there, and you could imagine they probably got a lot of feedback about that, and you run into a weird problem with companies like Facebook where there's this notion of yeah, but is this a problem on Facebook scale, or is it only 1 million users? Which sounds pretty wild to most people.
They also failed the make sure this is beneficial to your consumers argument, and all they're doing is making sure that if you had an Instagram account but didn't necessarily have a Facebook account or whatever, then tough, you're screwed. You have to go and get a Facebook account. So this is done purely for conversion, right? They just want more people to have more data. They just want more passports uploaded. There's no other benefit to this. There's no security angle. They're just mining data. So as well as doing a messy rollout, they also don't have any particularly good reason for doing it apart from just money. So this isn't the worst in the world. It's just the messiest I've seen. Often people just turn things off. Strava have done a few where they're just I used to be able to do this on the API, but people kept making competing products, so we just turned it off. Twitter have done that a bunch. You can't use this to make a Twitter client anymore. Facebook have done it because Cambridge Analytica was getting way too much data out of our API, and we pretended we didn't notice. So we've turned this API off so that other people can't do it. Things like that. Stuff does just get turned off on a whim sometimes, and that's when you need to make sure that you've got circuit breakers and redundancies built into your application so that you're not just assuming it's always up, because if it vanishes overnight, then
Yeah, it's bad. We've probably talked about some of the tooling too that you probably noticed with things breaking in that case, because I'd imagine you have a statically generated site, but it's also very good to be able to have things set up to shout at you when changes that don't completely break your site are happening there. which I think we've probably talked about on past podcasts. Do you guys have any episodes of, or sorry, any episodes, any examples of other rollouts that have gone poorly?
Not off the top of my head. This was something I meant to look up. It's one of those things you see something come by on Twitter and everyone's like, "Oh shit!" and everyone just starts laughing. And then I always feel like I should put those in a list somewhere of people what done messed up.
Right.
But yeah, there's just a lot of them. Honestly, people do it all the time. Most companies that are just getting the hang of APIs, like we often think about them as being around for a long time, kind of the API first mentality has been around since 2007 or whatever it is, something, and kind of they're both very new to some companies and something that companies should be quite experienced with at the same time somehow. But you get companies that are kind of just getting into it, and they're really just in love with lockstep deployments. They're like, it doesn't really matter if we massively rewrite this whole API and change everything, because we'll push a deployment and we'll update the iOS app and we'll update the web app all at the same time, and it will be fine. And then that never works, ever. And if there's any other systems using it, then that's a problem. One brilliant example from WeWork, actually, of a deprecation that went poorly. Deprecating something for 30 days and then looking to see if it was being used in the last 30 days. But some months have 31 days, and some scripts run monthly.
Oh boy.
So I think the script runs at like midnight on the first of the month or whatever it is, because all of the people's key cards, all of the people's memberships and registrations would start on the first of the month. And this endpoint was only ever being used as part of that monthly cron script that would happen on the first of the month. And then so somebody on the 31st checks to see if that's been used recently and goes, no one's used it in a month, let's get rid of that. And then the very next day, everything just completely shits. Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, well intentioned, but definitely for getting a real problem with reality there. I do have one example of a deprecation that went well, or maybe about as well as it could for something that's super high impact. And this is it's actually for a library rather than sort of a traditional API. But at one point on the internet, just about every major web application was using a JavaScript library for asynchronous HTTP requests, AJAX requests, and it was called Request. And starting on March 30th, 2019, they announced that they were going to deprecate Request entirely. So the whole library was no longer essentially going to be changed, updated, maintained. And I'll drop a link to this in the notes for the show here. But they started that initial post with like a literal history of the Request project and how it started, how it grew, all these other things, and made a case for like, and now it's time to move on because there are other things that do this a lot better. And it doesn't make sense to keep maintaining this library. And as we record this now, it's been, like I said, almost 2 years since March 30th, 2019. There are literally thousands of comments on this GitHub issue talking about it. Actually, I guess only 360 comments, lots of related pull requests, and thousands of like reactions to comments on it. And it's a really great example of clear communication, support from the community, and so you'll even see some of the growing pains in the comments in there that are related to people making changes to it. But I think maybe the most interesting thing is a feature of GitHub where if things are public, you can see all of the pull requests and issues that are related to this issue. And there are just dozens and dozens and dozens where you can see people looking at making these changes, linking to the issue, and really creating like almost a graph of people affected by this change. And it's pretty gigantic. And as far as I can tell, this hasn't broken the internet and was definitely one of those things that had the potential to. So it's a really interesting thing to check out. And I'll link to that because I think it's one of those exemplars that we should be talking about more.
That's awesome.
I mean, it's not,
check a link in there.
Yeah, it's not API specific, but Moment.js has also done a really good job of deprecating their whole library. And Moment is such a big, well-used, well-tested library for doing date-time things in JavaScript, but eventually they were like, this library's kind of outgrown itself. Here is why we're kind of stepping back and here's your replacements for a moment. So I think like something like that is probably one of the best things you can do if you're going to deprecate an API is maybe give a little bit of an explanation why, so people aren't just like, you're taking away my endpoints. And then also make sure you suggest, hey, endpoint A is going down, but we also have B, C, D, and E are all API endpoints that can cover your needs and help you out the best in multiple different ways. And it's kind of on you to figure out the best way, but we're going a little bit above and beyond just to help you out.
Wow, I had no idea they deprecated. That's interesting. It looks like this all happened at the end of last year. Yeah, that's a massive library, and their API is really complex. Probably for good reason that they're deprecating it, because it was getting very heavy. But yeah, that team does a really great job of communication through and through.
Yeah, and I mean, like if you're doing this API world, I think both Ruby and at least Laravel has middleware you can shove into your API stack and set the sunset header and kind of just set it and not forget it, but you can at least kind of automate this whole process. And so that way, when you're responding to a request, if you know this API is going down, the sunset header is automatically there. And then it kind of frees you of that burden a little bit and kind of puts the onus back onto the consumer to say, hey, here's your notice, you have 90 days or whatever, and we want to help you out, but you've got to at least kind of meet us halfway.
Yeah. This is something I recently wrote an article for Stoplight about deprecating API endpoints, right? Like very similar to the topics here, but a bit more hands-on actually how that will work, and I'll make sure we've got a link in the show notes there. And yeah, there's kind of two main places that HTTP-based API people might want to put in a deprecation. And one of those places might be OpenAPI to help update your documentation if you're using OpenAPI. And another place might be the code, where either you're using one of these convenient middleware libraries, or you're literally just adding a header yourself, like you just response.headers, dot deprecation equals. However you're setting that header and however you're doing it in documentation, the whole point of OpenAPI that we've been trying to get sorted out for a really long time is that instead of having two different sources of truth, instead of having all of your validation rules in OpenAPI and then copying all of your validation rules again over to the actual API, you can just use request validation middlewares that look at OpenAPI and say, oh, I already know how to validate this incoming request. You don't have to write code for that. And in the exact same way, I want to move away from the idea of kind of request validation middlewares and just like general validation middlwares, like general OpenAPI middlewares, where as well as just saying like, is this request correct and is the response coming back correct? But like, is there anything else we should put in the response? Should we put a deprecation notice in there? Should we put a sunset notice in there? Because if the information's available in OpenAPI already, there's no reason why you should have to duplicate that information and potentially have those two dates disagreeing with each other in the code. So yeah, again, I think there's room for tooling to help join up OpenAPI and what people are actually writing for code, because then it's really similar to what GraphQL and gRPC do. gRPC and GraphQL both cover property level deprecations, but they don't really cover like endpoint or method or mutation or query or whatever you call it. They don't cover the deprecation of that entire thing. If you want to deprecate an entire mutation or an entire query, you have to, in GraphQL, you have to deprecate all of the properties, and then people kind of get the hint that the whole thing's gone, right? So that's a little different there. But they don't have two different places that you do it. You whatever GraphQL system you're using, you put in the type that is being deprecated, and then if you are rendering documentation, it's there, and if you are using code, it will probably give you a warning. So they've already done the gluing up, and it just means that the OpenAPI community has just a little bit of work to do to glue up those things, and then yeah, you've got the endpoint level deprecations just sorted straight off the bat, and there are ways that you could get the property deprecations sorted out, like putting them into SDK generators and things like that as well,
Yeah, always good to see when the tooling can remove a little bit of redundancy and take away some of that everyone does it their own way feeling, which can really slow down development across the board.
Yeah, and then maybe next time Facebook are looking at like, oh, how do we deprecate something in HTTP? They won't just randomly start chucking a 400 status code in there and break everything. They'll be like, oh, there's this convenient tool we could use that does it a sensible way based on standards.
Yeah, maybe don't hold your breath on that one, but it's
Sometimes
hopeful.
I like to dream.
Sometimes. I mean, maybe one day Facebook will return a 400 bad request with a status body of everything's good. And then the whole world will just flip upside down.
You know how there's so many people out there that are just like, status codes don't matter. It doesn't matter at all. There's no reason why you should ever change your status codes. I feel like either everyone at Facebook is that, or the decision makers maybe, and like there's not a single person that's gone, actually those conventions matter, and here are the reasons why. Like, it helps with caching, it helps with monitoring software, it helps with anything that was expecting the convention of HTTP to be respected. But if you say 200 when there's an error and you say 400 when things are fine, then nothing's going to work ever. It's weird. Anyway,
it's weird how that works. And then of course you break trust with your users too, which ultimately to kind of put a bow on this whole thing is deprecating endpoints, doing the right status codes, handling the HTTP verbs. There's an extra T there. Correctly, all is in the name of developing a sense of trust with your consumers. So that way, when you do deprecate an endpoint, no one is thinking it's out of malice or spite, but because you're doing the best thing for your business or your API, whatever it is. So ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're thinking about deprecating an endpoint, you want to make sure you're doing it thoughtfully, insightfully, and intentionally as well. So that way, when the time does come to deprecate an endpoint, you don't have angry users up in your Twitter DMs, but instead you have people already migrating to the new endpoints, and you can go ahead and safely turn those old API endpoints off. So I think that kind of wraps everything up for us today. Any last thoughts we want to get out there, guys?
you got anything, Mike?
No, that's about it for me. Take care of yourselves. Be good to each other. All that usual stuff.
Sweet. My note is OpenAPI 3.1 was officially announced yesterday.
Yeah.
It's actually out now. This is a little unfortunate because not that many tools are ready for it yet. But like, it's one of those really annoying chicken and egg things if so many tooling developers don't bother to support something until it's final. Which means those release candidates last far too long because they haven't got enough feedback to be confident they can release the final yet. So this time I'm hoping the tools will be very quick to upgrade. I know Stoplight are working hard, Postman are working hard, SmartFare are working hard. Everyone's working hard to get onto OpenAPI 3.1. Where we'll probably see a bit less speed is some of the kind of random single author maintainer open source packages. But hopefully there's a bit of convergence and people stop maintaining, 150 different versions of the same little package and kind of come together to kind of get onto OpenAPI 3.1 together. And we'll start to see the tooling mature and congregate that way. But the fact that OpenAPI 3.1 is out now is brilliant because as well as adding some cool new stuff, it's got webhooks, that's great. It also solves the JSON schema OpenAPI discrepancy where OpenAPI is a subset, superset, side set that adds some bits, removes some bits, and changes some bits of JSON schema, which has plagued me for 3 years. I've got a little counter running that's just like, number of days since I've had to explain that JSON schema and OpenAPI are different. 0! So we'll talk about that more in an upcoming episode, but I just wanted to give everyone the great news that OpenAPI 3.1 is out. It's final.
Awesome. Yeah, can't wait to talk about that in another episode. And until then, we will see everyone later.
Cheers.
Take it easy, guys.